I never thought I'd watch 35 brand-new homes sink beneath a wall of water, but as the dam gates groaned open and the first flood rushed forward, all I felt was justice finally unleashed. The sound came first, a low rumble that seemed to rise from the earth itself, like thunder trapped underground. Then the water appeared, a brown-green wall taller than a man, carrying with it decades of rain and snowmelt that had waited patiently behind concrete and steel. It swept down the valley with the fury of nature reclaiming what was always hers. Mrs. Patterson from Willow Creek Lane screamed first. Her voice pierced the morning air as she watched the flood surge past her white picket fence, swallowing her prize-winning rose garden in seconds. The manicured lawns of Sunset Ridge, development, lawns that had been planted where my cattle once grazed, disappeared beneath churning water that smelled of river mud and broken promises. I stood on the ridge above it all, my weathered hands gripping the rusty wheel that controlled the dam's ancient gates. Below me, the neighborhood that had stolen my inheritance was drowning in the consequences of their greed. The HOA president, Richard Mansfield, stood in his driveway wearing his silk pajamas and Italian leather slippers, his mouth hanging open as muddy water lapped at his Porsche. They had built on land that was mine. They had mocked me, humiliated me, called me a bitter old fool who couldn't accept progress. They thought they'd won with their lawyers and their bribes and their city council connections. But they forgot one thing. I still controlled the dam. The water didn't discriminate. It swept through million-dollar homes with the same indifference it showed to tool sheds. Foundations cracked like eggshells, driveways buckled and twisted. The community center where they'd held their smug HOA meetings floated past like a lost ship, its Excellence in Community Living banner trailing in the current like a surrender flag. I had watched them build this neighborhood from my kitchen window for 2 years. Every morning, I'd made my coffee and stood at the sink, watching bulldozers tear up the pasture where my father had taught me to ride. I'd seen them plant their subdivision where wildflowers used to bloom in spring. I'd counted 35 houses rising like monuments to their arrogance, each one a slap in the face to everything my family had built on this land. But today, as I watched their perfect community dissolve into chaos, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd named their streets things like Peaceful Valley Drive and Harmony Hills Court. They'd put up signs promising luxury living in nature's paradise. Nature was showing them paradise today. All right, the kind that washes away the sins of the greedy and returns the earth to those who respect it. Emergency sirens wailed in the distance, but they were too late. The damage was done. Not the kind of damage that kills. I wasn't a murderer, just a man protecting what was his. The water was deep enough to destroy, but shallow enough that anyone with sense could wade to safety. Though watching some of these city folks struggle through knee-deep mud in their designer clothes almost made me smile. The news crews would arrive within the hour. The investigation would begin by afternoon. The lawsuits would fly like autumn leaves, thick and desperate. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that for the first time in 2 years, my land was mine again. They called me William Bull Henderson, a name I'd earned not from anger, but from the stubborn determination that ran in my family like the creek that fed this valley. My father had been Bull Henderson before me, and his father before him. We didn't give up, and we didn't give in. That's what they never understood about people like us. As the water began to recede, leaving behind a landscape of mud and twisted metal where their perfect neighborhood once stood, I thought about my father's words. Son, land isn't something you own. It's something that owns you. And if you betray that trust, the land will find a way to remind you who's really in charge. They built on land that was mine. They thought concrete and legal papers could erase generations of sweat and sacrifice. They thought they could bulldoze history and plant their future on top of the ruins. But they forgot that water always finds a way. I closed the dam gates slowly, metal grinding against metal in a song as old as the valley itself. The neighborhood below looked like a war zone now, a battlefield where nature had claimed victory over greed. Some of the houses still stood, but they were wounded, their foundations compromised, their perfect facades cracked and stained with the mud of justice. Richard Mansfield was shouting into his phone, probably calling his lawyers, his insurance company, anyone who might help him make sense of what had just happened. He kept pointing up at me on the ridge, his face red with rage and disbelief. Let him point. Let him scream. The truth had a way of floating to the surface, just like everything else the flood had carried. Downstream, but to understand how it came to this, to understand why a 70-year-old rancher would stand on a dam and watch the world wash away, you need to hear the story of how they took everything from me and why I had no choice but to let the water flow. This wasn't just dirt and trees. It was the last piece of my father I had left. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in March, 2 years before the flood. I remember because it was the first warm day of spring, and I was fixing the fence line where the old oak had fallen during winter storms. The mailman, Jerry Castillo, had to walk all the way up the drive to find me because the letter was registered, requiring my signature. "Looks important, Bull," Jerry said, wiping sweat from his forehead. He'd been delivering mail to Henderson Land for 23 years, had watched me bury my father and struggled to keep the ranch running after Mom passed. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive paper that felt foreign in my work-calloused hands. The return address read Mansfield Development Group in raised gold lettering. I tore it open right there by the fence, the spring breeze carrying the scent of new grass and wild lupine across the valley. "Dear Mr. Henderson," it began, "we represent a consortium of investors interested in purchasing your property for development purposes. We are prepared to offer $2.3 million for your 847-acre ranch, pending environmental and geological surveys." I stopped reading and looked up at the land spread before me. 847 acres of rolling hills, creek bottom, and timber that had been in my family since 1887. My great-grandfather, Jeremiah Henderson, had homesteaded here when this was still frontier country, when wolves still howled in the mountains and the railroad was just a dream in some surveyor's notebook. Every acre held a memory. The south pasture where I'd learned to ride bareback on my father's old mare, Dolly. The swimming hole where my brother Jake and I had spent endless summer days before the war took him to Vietnam and never brought him back. The ridge where Dad and I had built hunting blinds and watched the seasons change, where he'd taught me that land wasn't something you possessed, but something you stewarded. $2.3 million, I said aloud, testing how the number felt in my mouth. It was more money than I'd see in 3 lifetimes of ranching. More than enough to buy a comfortable house in town, maybe travel a little, live easy in my retirement years. But some things weren't for sale. I walked back to the house, the letter crumpled in my fist. The old ranch house sat in a grove of cottonwoods my grandmother had planted as a young bride. It wasn't much to look at. Weathered pine siding, a tin roof that sang in the rain, a wraparound porch where four generations of Henderson men had watched the sun set over their land. But it was home in the deepest sense of that word. The dam had been built in 1952, the year I was born. Dad had worked with the Army Corps of Engineers to design it, a modest structure meant to control spring flooding and provide irrigation water for the valley's ranchers. It wasn't much compared to the massive concrete monuments they built on big rivers, but it had done its job for 70 years, holding back Cedar Creek's seasonal fury and releasing water when the crops needed it. Dad used to take me up there when I was small, his big hand wrapped around mine as we climbed the rocky path to the dam's maintenance platform. He'd show me the gates, the spillway, the gauges that measured water depth and pressure. "This little dam protects everyone downstream," he'd say. "Someday, son, you'll be responsible for it. Water's more powerful than most folks realize. Treat it with respect, and it'll serve you well. Make it angry, and it'll remind you who's boss." The dam came with water rights dating back to territorial days, legal documents that made me the guardian of Cedar Creek's flow. It was a responsibility I'd inherited along with everything else, one that connected me to the land in ways no city developer could understand. 2 weeks after the first letter, they came in person. I was mucking out horse stalls when I heard the cars coming up the gravel drive. Through the barn door, I watched a convoy of black SUVs and luxury sedans kick up dust clouds as they approached the house. City cars, expensive and clean, their paint jobs reflecting the morning sun like mirrors. The lead vehicle stopped near my front porch, and out stepped a man in his 50s wearing a suit that probably cost more than I spent on feed in a month. His hair was silver gray and styled like a politician's, and his smile was the kind that never reached the eyes. Behind him came 3 other men, all cut from the same cloth, successful, predatory, accustomed to getting what they wanted. "Mr. Henderson?" The silver-haired man extended a manicured hand. "I'm Richard Mansfield, Mansfield Development Group. I believe you received our letter?" I didn't shake his hand. Instead, I leaned on my pitchfork and studied their faces, reading them the way Dad had taught me to read storm clouds. "I got your letter. I also got a trash can. Both served their purpose." Mansfield's smile tightened, but he pressed on. "I understand your attachment to this place, Mr. Henderson. It's been in your family for generations. But you have to think practically. You're getting older, and maintaining a ranch this size is expensive. Our offer would set you up for a comfortable retirement." "Comfortable retirement," I repeated. "What makes you think I want to retire?" One of the other men stepped forward, younger than Mansfield, with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd never been told no. "Mr. Henderson, we're not just talking about your future here. We're talking about the future of this entire valley. Progress doesn't wait for anyone. If you don't sell to us, eventually someone else will force the issue through eminent domain. At least this way, you profit from the inevitable." The words hung in the morning air like gun smoke, a threat wrapped in silk and delivered with a smile, but a threat nonetheless. I straightened up, my father's blood stirring in my veins. "Progress," I said slowly. "That's what you call it when you bulldoze a century of family history to build cookie-cutter houses for city folks who will never know the names of the wildflowers they're paving over? We call it giving families an opportunity to own beautiful homes in a pristine natural setting," Mansfield said. "Sunset Ridge Development will be a model community. Luxury homes, golf course, community center. Property values for the entire area will increase dramatically." I looked past them to the valley that stretched beyond my pastures, imagining it carved up into streets with names like Heritage Oak Lane and Pioneer Point Drive, sanitized versions of the real history they were erasing. I pictured sprinkler systems watering exotic grass, where native buffalo grass had grown for millennia. Imagined the sound of leaf blowers replacing the evening songs of meadowlarks. "My answer is no," I said simply. "It was no when I read your letter, and it's no now. This land isn't for sale." The younger man's face flushed red. "You're making a mistake, old man. This valley's going to be developed with or without your cooperation. You can be part of the solution, or part of the problem. I reckon I'll choose to be part of the problem then." They left that day with polite threats and promises that we'd talk again soon. I watched their convoy disappear down the county road, kicking up dust that settled slowly on my fence posts and mailbox. That dust felt like an omen, the first sign of the storm that was coming. That evening, I walked up to the dam as the sun set behind the western peaks. The water was high from spring snowmelt, and I could hear its voice calling through the spillway. Ancient, patient, powerful. Dad's spirit felt close in that place, and I whispered a promise to the gathering darkness. I won't let them take it, Dad. Whatever it costs, whatever they try, I won't let them destroy what you built. The creek sang its approval, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled like it was calling all the ghosts of the valley to witness my oath. I should have known then that promises made to the dead have a way of demanding payment from the living. But some debts are worth paying, no matter the price. The first time they trespassed, I thought it was a mistake. By the third time, I knew it was war. It started with surveyors. 3 weeks after Mansfield's visit, I found a crew of men with orange vests and expensive equipment measuring my land like it already belonged to them. They were working the boundary line between my property and the old Morrison place, which had been empty since Sarah Morrison died and her city-dwelling children sold it to pay estate taxes. I rode out on horseback. My father's Winchester balanced across my saddle horn. The crew looked up as I approached, their faces showing the nervous uncertainty of men who knew they were where they shouldn't be. "Morning, gentlemen," I called out, my voice carrying the edge that had earned me my nickname. "Mind telling me what you're doing on my land?" The crew chief, a thin man with a clipboard and the pallor of someone who spent his life in offices, cleared his throat. "We're conducting a boundary survey for the Morrison property development. According to our records, this area falls within the purchased land." I dismounted slowly, deliberately, making sure they could see the rifle. "According to my records, which include a deed signed by President McKinley, this has been Henderson land since 1887. You're trespassing." The man pulled out a folded paper, his hands shaking slightly. "Sir, we have documentation from the county showing an adjustment to the property lines based on a recent geological survey. There seems to have been an error in the original survey markers." I took the paper and examined it. Official-looking letterhead, county seal, language thick with legal jargon. But underneath all the fancy words, it was simple theft dressed up as bureaucracy. They were claiming that the original Henderson boundary had been mismarked, that 23 acres of my best pasture land actually belonged to the Morrison estate, and now to Mansfield Development. "This is interesting fiction," I said, handing the paper back. "But it's still trespassing. You have 10 minutes to pack up your equipment and get off my land before I call the sheriff." The crew chief made a phone call while his men hastily gathered their tools. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I watched his face grow pale as he listened to whoever was on the other end. When he hung up, he looked like a man who'd just been told his medical test results weren't good. "We'll be back," he said quietly. "This isn't over." "No," I agreed. "I don't reckon it is." I agreed. "I don't reckon it is." They returned the next week with a sheriff's deputy. Deputy Martinez was a good man. Someone I'd known since he was a kid running around his grandfather's ranch in the next valley over. He looked uncomfortable as he delivered the court order requiring me to allow the survey to continue pending resolution of the boundary dispute. "I'm sorry." "Bull," he said privately, while the surveyors unloaded their equipment. "I know this stinks, but there's nothing I can do. They've got paperwork, and paperwork trumps common sense these days." The paperwork war had begun. Over the next month, I was buried in legal documents, notices of this, orders for that, requirements to respond within time frames that seemed designed to trip up anyone without a law degree. Each envelope brought new accusations, that my property lines were incorrect, that my water rights were being investigated, that my ranch was in violation of updated environmental regulations that didn't exist when my father filed his permits. The harassment escalated beyond paperwork. They started with small things, carefully planned to seem like accidents or misunderstandings. My mailbox got knocked over 3 times in 2 weeks. "Kids being kids," the deputy said, even though the nearest kids lived 20 miles away. Someone cut my fence line on the road frontage, letting my cattle wander onto the county road where they caused a minor traffic jam. The repair bill came with a fine for allowing livestock to endanger public safety. The construction began without warning on a Tuesday morning in August. I woke to the sound of diesel engines and backup alarms, the mechanical symphony of destruction that would become the soundtrack to my life for the next 2 years. From my kitchen window, I watched a convoy of bulldozers, excavators, and dump trucks roll onto what they claimed was their land. The smell hit me first: diesel exhaust mixed with dust, and the green scent of torn vegetation. Then came the sound of trees falling, the crash and groan of cottonwoods and willows that had grown along Cedar Creek for decades. They were clearing the land methodically, efficiently, with the cold precision of a surgical amputation. I called the sheriff's office, but Deputy Martinez sounded tired when he answered. "Bull, I've got their permits right here. Everything's legal according to the county. I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do unless they cross your new property line." New property line? The words tasted bitter. "That's my land they're tearing up, Miguel. I was born in sight of those trees." "I know, Bull. I know. But the courts will have to sort this out. Until then, my hands are tied." I hung up and walked out to the porch, watching my childhood disappear one tree at a time. The swimming hole where Jake and I had spent summer afternoons was gone by noon, filled in and graded flat. The grove where we'd built our first fort was turned into a staging area for equipment. Each tree that fell felt like losing a family member. But the worst was yet to come. 3 days later, I found them working on what was unquestionably my land. A crew was installing fence posts 50 yards inside my original boundary line, effectively claiming another strip of Henderson property. When I confronted the foreman, he showed me an updated survey that had mysteriously appeared overnight, adjusting the boundary even further into my ranch. "You can't be serious," I said, staring at the new map. "This puts your property line through my barn." The foreman, a sunburned man named Chuck who seemed genuinely sympathetic, shrugged helplessly. "I just build what they tell me to build, Mr. Henderson. I don't make the maps." That afternoon, I received a certified letter from something called the Sunset Ridge Homeowners Association, an organization that didn't exist yet, but apparently already had lawyers. The letter informed me that my encroaching structures, meaning my barn, cattle shed, and equipment storage building, were in violation of the community's planned architectural standards and would need to be removed within 30 days. I read that letter 3 times, each reading stoking the fire in my chest a little higher. They weren't just stealing my land. They were trying to drive me off what remained of it by making it impossible to ranch. Without those buildings, I couldn't store hay, shelter cattle, or maintain equipment. They might as well have demanded I stop breathing. That evening, I sat on my porch with a whiskey and watched them work under floodlights, their machines crawling over my stolen ground like metallic locusts. The night air carried the sound of their progress: backup alarms, hydraulic whines, the beep, beep, beep of machinery that never slept. Somewhere in the darkness, I heard the voice of Cedar Creek, running high and fast with late summer storms. The water sounded angry, like it was trying to tell me something. I thought about the dam upstream, about the gates that controlled the flow, about the power that still rested in my hands. My father had always said that water was patient, but not forgiving. It would wait decades for its chance, but when that chance came, it never missed. I finished my whiskey and went inside, but I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with my father's old survey maps spread before me, comparing them to the fraudulent documents Mansfield's people had filed. The theft was obvious to anyone who bothered to look. But who was going to bother? The county commissioners were either bought or incompetent. The sheriff was handcuffed by paperwork, and I couldn't afford the kind of lawyers it would take to fight a development company with unlimited resources. But I had something they didn't have, something they'd forgotten about in their rush to steal my land and build their perfect community. I had control of the water that would flow past their million-dollar homes, through their manicured parks, under their carefully planned bridges. I had the dam. The next morning, I woke to find them breaking ground on the first house foundation, right in the middle of what used to be my south pasture, the same field where my grandfather had grown wheat during the Depression. A concrete truck was pouring the footprint of someone else's dream on top of my family's legacy. I stood on my porch in my underwear and boots, coffee cup in hand, and watched them pour concrete over my history. The irony wasn't lost on me. They were building their future on the foundation of my past, literally covering up generations of Henderson sweat and sacrifice with their suburban paradise. But concrete cracks, and when it does, water finds every weakness, every flaw, every shortcut taken by contractors more interested in profit than permanence. I raised my coffee cup toward the construction site in a mock toast. "Build away, boys," I whispered to the morning wind. "Build your castles in my pasture. But remember, I still control the moat." I stood on my porch and watched them build a neighborhood where my cattle once grazed. By October, the skeleton of their first street was taking shape. They'd named it Peaceful Valley Drive, which felt like a slap in the face every time I saw the street sign. There was nothing peaceful about the way they'd taken the land, and it damn sure wasn't a valley anymore. They'd graded and leveled until the natural contours of the earth were erased, replaced by the artificial geometry of suburban planning. From my kitchen window, I had a front-row seat to watch my inheritance disappear house by house. The framers came first, raising walls with the efficiency of barn-raising crews. Except these barns were designed for people who'd never seen a real barn in their lives. Then came the roofers, the siding crews, the landscapers who planted exotic shrubs where prairie grass used to wave in the wind. Each morning brought new sounds: hammers, saws, the backup alarms of delivery trucks. The Symphony of Progress, they called it. To me, it sounded like a funeral dirge played on power tools. The worst part wasn't watching them build. The worst part was watching my neighbors turn against me. Sarah Whitman had lived in the valley for 40 years, raising 4 kids on the ranch adjacent to mine. Her late husband Tom and I had shared irrigation water, helped each other with difficult calves, traded labor during hay season. Sarah had brought casseroles when my mother died, had sat with me at Tom's funeral when cancer took him. Now she wouldn't meet my eyes at the post office. "You're being stubborn." "Bull," she told me one day as we both picked up our mail. "Richard Mansfield came by last week. He's a nice man, very professional. He explained what they're trying to do, how much property values are going to increase. We could all benefit if you'd just stop being so selfish." Selfish? The word hit me like a physical blow. Protecting 4 generations of family history was selfish. Refusing to let developers destroy the land my great-grandfather had homesteaded was selfish. Standing up to theft dressed up as progress was selfish. "Did he tell you where he's getting the water for all those new houses?" I asked. "Did he mention that Cedar Creek runs dry 3 months out of every 5 without the dam release? Or that the septic systems for 35 homes are going to leach into the same aquifer that feeds your well?" Sarah's face flushed. "He said you were spreading lies to try and stop development. He said if you really cared about this community, you'd think about everyone's future, not just your own past." I looked at this woman I'd known for decades, searching her face for some sign of the friend who'd once shared Christmas dinners and birthday parties with my family. But the Sarah standing before me now was a stranger, wearing my friend's face, but speaking Richard Mansfield's words. "Sarah," I said quietly, "when your well runs dry and your property taxes triple, remember this conversation." She turned and walked away without another word. Through the post office window, I watched her climb into a brand-new pickup truck, newer and shinier than any vehicle she'd owned when Tom was alive. That's when I understood their strategy. They weren't just stealing my land, they were buying my neighbors. The bribes were subtle but effective. Sarah got a new truck and a check for agreeing to provide equipment access across her property. The Kowalski family suddenly had money for home improvements they'd been putting off for years. Even old Pete Murphy, whose ranch bordered mine on the west side, started talking about the benefits of development after Mansfield offered to pay for a new barn as a gesture of community goodwill. One by one, the people who should have been my allies were bought off, charmed, or convinced that progress was inevitable and resistance was futile. The community that had stood together through droughts, floods, and economic hardship crumbled under the weight of Richard Mansfield's checkbook. But it wasn't just money that turned them. It was hope. Most of the ranchers in our valley were hanging on by their fingernails. Cattle prices hadn't kept pace with feed costs, property taxes were rising every year, and young people were leaving for cities where they could make a living that didn't depend on weather and commodity markets. Mansfield offered them something they'd almost forgotten existed: financial security. "Think about your retirement, Bull," Pete Murphy told me one afternoon as we watched his new barn being built. "Think about your legacy. You could sell your place for enough to set up a trust fund for generations. Isn't that better than holding on to something you can't pass down anyway?" "Who says I can't pass it down?" Pete looked uncomfortable. "Well, you don't have kids, and your brother— Jake's been gone a long time. Who's going to inherit? Some distant cousin who'll sell it anyway?" He was right, and we both knew it. I'd never married, never had children. Jake had died in Vietnam without kids of his own. When I passed, the Henderson line would end with me, and the land would go to whatever relatives could be found in probate court. They'd probably sell it to whoever offered the most money, which would likely be another development company just like Mansfield's. That knowledge sat in my stomach like a stone. 4 generations of Henderson men had worked this land, had carved a life out of wilderness and prairie, had survived the Depression and 2 world wars and the endless cycle of drought and plenty that defined ranching in the Mountain West. And it was all going to end with me, the last bull. In a dying herd, maybe Pete was right. Maybe selling was the smart choice, the practical choice. Maybe I was just a stubborn old man clinging to a past that didn't matter to anyone but me. But late at night, when I sat on my porch, listening to the creek sing its ancient song, I could feel my father's presence in the wind. I could hear my grandfather's voice in the rustle of cottonwood leaves. The land held their spirits, their sweat, their dreams. How do you sell your family's ghosts? The harassment escalated as winter approached. Someone spray-painted "Sell Out" on the side of my barn in red letters 3 feet tall. My cattle started getting sick after drinking from Creekside Pond. The veterinarian found traces of antifreeze in their water, though he couldn't prove it wasn't an accident. My truck tires were slashed twice in the same week, and the sheriff's office suggested it might be random vandalism. The HOA, still theoretical, but apparently fully operational, began sending me official notices about violations of community standards. My barn was too close to the new property line. My cattle were creating odor problems for future residents. My barbed wire fencing was a visual blight that decreased property values for the entire development. Each letter came with legal language that made my head spin, and deadlines that seemed designed to trip me up. Respond within 10 days or face escalated penalties. Correct violations within 30 days or face litigation. Comply with new regulations that hadn't existed yesterday or face financial consequences that could force the sale of my property. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, and they were wielding the blade with surgical precision. The breaking point came on a cold December morning when I woke to find construction crews working in my front yard. Not near my property line, not on disputed territory, but in the patch of ground between my house and the county road where my mailbox stood. I pulled on boots and a coat and stormed out to confront them. The crew chief, a different man than before, showed me a work order for utility easement, improvements that apparently gave them the right to tear up my driveway to install water and sewer lines for the development. "You Can't run utilities through my property without my permission, I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they were wrong. The paperwork would be in order. The permits would be legal. They'd found another way to slice off a piece of my land while making it look legitimate. "I'm afraid we can, sir," the crew chief said, not unkindly. "The county has eminent domain authority for essential utilities. We're required to restore your driveway when we're finished." Of course, I stood in the cold morning air, watching strangers tear up the ground my grandfather had walked, feeling something break inside me that had been cracking for months. This wasn't just about land anymore. It was about dignity, about the right to exist in the place where your family had always belonged. They were slowly, methodically, legally destroying everything I was. That afternoon, I received a call from my insurance company. Due to increased risk factors associated with construction activity in the area, my premiums were being increased by 300%. The letter would arrive in the mail, but they wanted to give me advance notice so I could make arrangements for continued coverage. I hung up the phone and sat in my father's old chair, staring out at the construction site that had once been my south pasture. Steam rose from coffee cups and exhaust pipes in the cold air, and I could hear the workers laughing about something as they installed sewer lines that would carry away the waste of people who didn't belong here. For the first time since this whole fight began, I felt like giving up. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe I was being selfish, clinging to the past while everyone else moved toward the future. Maybe it was time to take what I could get and find somewhere else to live out my remaining years. But then I heard it. The sound that had been the soundtrack to my entire life. So constant I usually didn't notice it anymore. The voice of Cedar Creek, running high with winter snowmelt, singing its way down the valley toward the dam that my father had helped build. The dam that was still mine to control. I walked to my kitchen window and looked upstream toward the ridge where concrete and steel held back millions of gallons of mountain water. Somewhere up there, patient and powerful, my secret weapon waited in the darkness. They thought they'd won. They thought they'd broken me down with their paperwork and their bribes and their relentless pressure. They thought an old man's stubbornness was no match for their money and their lawyers and their vision of progress. But they'd made one critical mistake. In their rush to steal my land and destroy my legacy, they'd forgotten about the one thing I still controlled. They'd built their dream neighborhood directly downstream from my dam, in the natural floodplain that my father had protected for 70 years. I smiled for the first time in months, feeling something stir in my chest that I'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Let them build their perfect community. Let them plant their exotic grass and install their decorative street lamps. Let them move in their families and hang their Christmas lights and pretend that concrete could erase history. But when the time came, and I was beginning to think that time was approaching, they were going to learn something about the power of water and the long memory of the land they'd stolen. They wanted to drown me in paperwork. Soon enough, I'd return the favor. They thought I was powerless. They forgot about the dam. The hike up to the dam had been part of my routine since childhood, but it felt different that cold January morning. My boots crunched through snow that sparkled in the weak winter sunlight, and my breath formed clouds that dissipated quickly in the thin mountain air. I wasn't just checking on the structure, like I had 1,000 times. Before, I was evaluating it with the eyes of a man who had been pushed too far. The dam sat in a narrow gorge where Cedar Creek cut through granite cliffs, a modest concrete structure that looked almost natural against the stone walls. 70 years of weather had stained its face with mineral deposits and moss, giving it the appearance of something that had always been there. But I knew better. I remembered helping Dad carry supplies up this trail when they were building it. Remembered watching the concrete pour that would hold back spring floods for generations. Standing on the maintenance platform, I could feel the power thrumming beneath my feet. Millions of gallons of snowmelt pressed against 30 feet of reinforced concrete. held in check by engineering that was simple but sound. The reservoir stretched back into the mountains, a finger of dark water that reflected the sky like polished obsidian. The control mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. A wheel that opened or closed steel gates, regulating the flow through the spillway. Dad had insisted on manual controls instead of the electric systems that were becoming popular in the 50s. Electricity fails, he'd said. Steel and concrete don't, if you build them right. I turned the wheel experimentally, feeling the resistance of water pressure against metal. The gates were old but well-maintained. I'd been up here every month for 20 years, greasing fittings, checking for corrosion, clearing debris from the intake. The mechanism moved smoothly, responsively, like a fine rifle that had been properly cared for. A memory surfaced from childhood. Dad, standing where I stood now, his big hands gripping the same wheel, explaining how the dam worked. Water wants to go downhill, son. That's the most basic law of nature. Our job isn't to stop it. That's impossible. Our job is to control when and where it goes. This little dam protects everyone downstream, gives them water when they need it, and keeps it back when they don't. But never forget, we're just borrowing this power. Make the water angry enough, and it'll remind you who's really in charge. Looking downstream from the dam, I could see the entire valley spread below me like a map. The original creek bed meandered through what had been my grandfather's wheat fields, past the grove where Jake and I had built forts, through the pasture where I'd learned to ride. But now, superimposed on that landscape of memory, was Mansfield's vision of progress. Peaceful Valley Drive cut a straight line through the natural contours of the land. Harmony Hills Court curved around what used to be my favorite fishing spot. The concrete foundations of 35 homes sat like gray scabs on the wounded earth, each one positioned perfectly to catch the maximum force of water if the dam were ever to release its full capacity. The irony was breathtaking. They'd built their dream neighborhood in the exact spot that had been the natural floodplain for thousands of years. Before the dam existed, Cedar Creek would swell with spring snowmelt and spread across the valley floor, depositing rich soil and nourishing the grasslands. It was that annual flooding that had made the land so fertile, so valuable for farming and ranching. But Mansfield's engineers had looked at flood maps from after 1952, when the dam was already controlling the flow. They'd seen 70 years of regulated water release and assumed that was the natural state of the creek. They'd built their community in a floodplain that existed only because my father's dam had been faithfully doing its job for 7 decades. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of the view downstream, documenting the positioning of every house, every street, every piece of infrastructure. The photos would never be evidence in any court. What I was contemplating was far beyond the reach of legal remedy. But I wanted to remember this moment, this clarity, this perfect understanding of the power that rested in my hands. The water rights were mine, legal and unassailable. The dam was on my property, built with my family's labor, and maintained with our sweat and dedication. The authority to control the flow of Cedar Creek had passed from father to son for 3 generations, and it would end with me, but not quietly, and not without consequence. I spent the rest of the morning inspecting every inch of the structure. The concrete was sound, showing only the minor cracks that were normal for a 70-year-old dam. The steel gates were solid, their hinges well greased and functional. The spillway was clear of debris, ready to carry whatever volume of water I chose to release. Most importantly, the mechanism that controlled the gates was entirely manual. No computers to hack, no electrical systems to fail, no remote controls that could be interfered with. Just steel wheels connected to steel cables connected to steel gates. Technology from an era when men built things to last. Things that worked when you needed them to work. As I hiked back down the trail, my mind was already working through the logistics. Timing would be critical. I'd need to wait for the right moment, when the reservoir was full and the downstream impact would be maximized. Spring snowmelt would provide the volume, but I'd need a trigger, an event that would justify what was about to happen. I also needed to think about aftermath. What I was contemplating was destruction of property, potentially on a massive scale. There would be investigations, lawsuits, possibly criminal charges. I was 70 years old. Spending my remaining years in prison wasn't an attractive prospect. But then I thought about Jake, killed in a jungle on the other side of the world, defending strangers' freedom. I thought about Dad, working 16-hour days to build something lasting for his sons. I thought about my grandfather, carving a life out of wilderness with nothing but determination and belief in the future. They'd all paid prices for their convictions. Maybe it was time for me to pay mine. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with Dad's old journals spread before me. He'd kept meticulous records of dam operations, water releases, maintenance schedules, 70 years of data about how water flowed through our valley. The journals told a story of drought years when every drop was precious, flood years when the dam held back destruction, normal years when the controlled release sustained life downstream. One entry, dated March 15, 1978, caught my attention. Heavy snowpack this year. Reservoir at capacity by early February. Had to make emergency release to prevent overflow. 50% gate. Low. 50% gate. Opening for 6 hours. Creek ran bank full through Henderson pasture. Good thing no one's fool enough to build in the floodplain. No one's fool enough to build in the floodplain. Dad's words from 45 years ago seemed like prophecy now. He'd understood something that Mansfield's engineers had missed. The dam didn't eliminate the floodplain. It just controlled when the flooding happened. Remove that control, and nature would reclaim what had always been hers. I found more entries documenting emergency releases, each one carefully calibrated to prevent dam failure while protecting downstream property. But all those releases had been done gradually, with advance warning to anyone who might be affected. Dad had called downstream neighbors, alerted the county sheriff, sometimes even helped evacuate livestock from low-lying areas. What I was contemplating was different. No warnings, no gradual release, no concern for anything except justice, finally flowing downstream with the power of accumulated snowmelt. I closed the journals and walked out onto my porch, looking down at the lights of Sunset Ridge development. Most of the houses were still under construction, but a few families had already moved in. I could see the glow of televisions through windows, the warm yellow light of kitchen lamps where people were sharing dinner, probably talking about their good fortune in finding such a beautiful place to build their lives. Part of me felt sorry for them. They were innocent victims of Mansfield's greed and fraud. They'd bought homes in good faith, trusting that the developer had done his due diligence, that the land was safe and legal and properly zoned for residential construction. But innocence didn't change geography. Innocence didn't alter the fact that they were living in a floodplain, protected only by the goodwill of a man they'd helped to destroy. Their developer had stolen that protection when he stole my land. Their HOA had endorsed that theft with every threatening letter, every legal maneuver, every attempt to drive me away from the place where I belonged. They'd wanted to be part of Mansfield's war against me. Soon, they'd discover what it meant to be casualties in that war. I went inside and pulled out a calendar, marking dates and making calculations. Spring snowmelt would begin in earnest by mid-March. The reservoir would reach capacity by early April. If I waited until the official grand opening celebration that Mansfield had scheduled for late April, the timing would be perfect. Maximum water volume, maximum number of residents, maximum media attention, maximum impact. I circled April 28th in red ink, the date Mansfield had chosen to celebrate his triumph over the stubborn old rancher who'd tried to stand in the way of progress. It would be the day the neighborhood celebrated its birth. It would also be the day it learned to fear the power of water and the long memory of the land it had stolen. I whispered a promise to the darkness outside my window, words that seemed to carry on the wind like smoke from an ancient fire. If they want to drown me in paperwork, I'll drown them in water. I wasn't the only one the HOA had crossed. The letter arrived 3 weeks after my revelation at the dam, forwarded through a chain of mutual acquaintances who knew better than to trust the regular mail. The return address simply said, "A friend," but the familiar handwriting belonged to Elena Vasquez, the investigative reporter for the Mountain Valley Tribune who'd been sniffing around development corruption for months. "Mr. Henderson," it read, "I believe we have common interests regarding Mansfield Development Group. Would you be willing to meet? I have information that might interest you, and I suspect you might have insights that could help my investigation. If you're willing, leave your porch light on tomorrow night. I'll find you." I left the porch light on. Elena arrived after midnight, driving a beat-up Honda with the headlights off, navigating my gravel drive by moonlight, like someone accustomed to avoiding attention. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 35, with the intense energy of a hunting dog that had caught a scent. Her handshake was firm, her eyes alert, and she carried a leather satchel that looked like it contained enough evidence to topple governments. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," she said, as we settled at my kitchen table. "I know you've been through hell with these people." "I'm curious why a reporter wants to meet in the middle of the night," I said. "Journalism usually happens in daylight." Elena smiled grimly. "Not when you're investigating people who own half the county commissioners and have the sheriff's office on speed dial. I've been working this story for 8 months, following money trails and permit irregularities. Your case is just the tip of the iceberg." She opened her satchel and spread documents across my table. Photographs, financial records, email printouts, legal filings. The evidence painted a picture of corruption so systematic it took my breath away. Mansfield Development has been pulling the same scheme across 3 counties, Elena explained, pointing to a map dotted with red pins. They identify properties they want, then use a network of bribed officials to create legal justifications for taking them. Fraudulent boundary surveys, manufactured environmental violations, trumped-up zoning changes, whatever it takes to force owners into selling or losing their land through legal manipulation. "How many families?" I asked, studying the map. 17 that I can prove. Probably twice that many who were too embarrassed or intimidated to come forward. Most of them were elderly, like you, people who'd lived on their land for generations and didn't have the resources to fight back. The rage that had been simmering in my chest for months suddenly flared into something white-hot and purifying. I wasn't just fighting for my own land. I was the latest victim in a predatory pattern that had destroyed dozens of families, scattered communities, erased histories that had taken lifetimes to build. "What about the sheriff's office?" I asked. Deputy Martinez seemed genuinely sorry about the situation. "Martinez is clean," Elena said. "So are most of the deputies. But Sheriff Hawkins has been taking campaign contributions from Mansfield for 3 years. Not illegal, but it explains why investigations keep getting delayed or misfiled. The county attorney's office is even worse. They're practically on Mansfield's payroll. She showed me financial records documenting a web of payments that stretched through the local power structure like roots through soil. Campaign contributions, consulting fees, speaking honorariums, donations to family members' businesses, all legal on the surface, but forming a pattern of influence that made honest governance impossible. The beautiful thing about their system, Elena continued, is that it's self-reinforcing. Every family they drive out is one less voice opposing development. Every property they acquire increases their political influence. They're not just building subdivisions, they're building a machine that makes it easier to acquire the next property and the next. I thought about Sarah Whitman's new truck, Pete Murphy's new barn, the other neighbors who'd been bought off or worn down. What about the people who take their money? The ones who should be standing up to them? Some are greedy, some are scared, some are just tired of fighting a system that seems rigged against them. Elena's voice carried no judgment, just weary understanding. Mansfield is very good at making resistance look futile and collaboration look smart. By the time people realize what they've really signed up for, it's too late to change sides. We talked until dawn, sharing information and building a picture of the enemy we faced. Elena's investigation had uncovered financial irregularities, permit fraud, and witness intimidation, but she needed more evidence to make charges stick. I had intimate knowledge of their tactics and access to records they thought they'd buried. But I was one man against an organization with unlimited resources. Together, though, we might be able to accomplish what neither of us could do alone. "There's something else," Elena said as she prepared to leave. "I've been in contact with other victims, families who've been fighting Mansfield in different counties. There's a group of us now, people who've lost everything to these bastards and want to see justice done." She handed me a business card with a phone number written on the back. "That's not my office line. If you want to meet the others, call that number and leave a message. Just say you're the rancher from Cedar Creek. They'll know what that means." 3 days later, I found myself in a diner in Millerville, 2 counties over, sitting in a back booth with 5 other people who'd lost their homes, their livelihoods, and their faith in the system to Mansfield Development's machine. There was Frank Kowalski, a wheat farmer whose family had worked the same land for 4 generations until Mansfield used eminent domain to run a highway access road through his property, destroying his irrigation system and making farming impossible. Mary Chen, a widow whose husband had built their retirement cabin with his own hands, only to have it condemned for structural deficiencies that appeared overnight in county records. Bob and Linda Martinez, no relation to the deputy, who'd lost their guest ranch when Mansfield convinced the state to declare their property a wildlife corridor that needed to be preserved by private development. Each story followed the same pattern: legal harassment, fraudulent documentation, pressure from neighbors who'd been bought off, and finally surrender when the cost of fighting became too high. Each victim had tried to work within the system, believing that truth and law would eventually prevail. Each had learned that money could bend both truth and law until they snapped. "We tried everything," Frank said, stirring coffee that had long since grown cold. "Lawyers, appeals, media coverage, petitions to the governor. Nothing worked. The system protects people like Mansfield. So, what's left?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Justice that doesn't depend on judges and politicians," Mary said quietly. "They've declared war on people like us. Maybe it's time we started fighting back." The conversation that followed was careful, coded, dancing around the edges of what we were all thinking. None of us were criminals by nature. We were farmers, ranchers, small business owners who'd never broken anything more serious than a speed limit. But we'd also been pushed beyond the boundaries of law and order into a place where traditional remedies no longer applied. "Whatever happens," Bob Martinez said, "it has to be proportional. We're not terrorists. We're not trying to hurt anyone. We just want them to face consequences for what they've done." "Consequences," I repeated, thinking about the dam and the power that waited behind its gates. Sometimes consequences have to be natural, things that can't be traced back to individuals or meetings in diners. Elena, who'd been quietly recording everything on a digital device, looked up. "I can document whatever happens. Make sure the right story gets told, that people understand why things unfolded the way they did. But I can't be part of planning anything that might be illegal." We understood. Elena's job was to expose the truth, not to help create it. But her documentation would be crucial for the aftermath, for making sure history recorded who the real villains were when everything finally came to light. As we prepared to leave, Frank pulled me aside. "I heard about your dam," he said quietly. "About the water rights and the floodplain they built on. If something were to happen, something natural and unavoidable, it would be a hell of a story." "Yes," I said, "it would be." We parted that night with no specific plans, no conspiracy, no criminal agreement. Just a shared understanding that sometimes justice arrives like a storm, sudden, powerful, and impossible to stop once the conditions are right. Over the following weeks, I noticed small acts of resistance beginning throughout the valley. Construction equipment broke down more frequently. Building permits were delayed by newly discovered technical problems. Deliveries got lost or delayed. Nothing dramatic, nothing traceable, just the kind of minor setbacks that happen when a community stops cooperating with its oppressor. Elena's articles began appearing in newspapers across the region, documenting the pattern of corruption and the human cost of uncontrolled development. The stories didn't stop Mansfield. His lawyers were too good and his political connections too strong, but they created a narrative that would matter when the reckoning finally came. Late one February night. As I sat on my porch, listening to the wind howl through the valley, I realized I was no longer alone in my anger. The resistance had grown beyond anything Mansfield could buy off or intimidate. He'd made the classic mistake of every tyrant in history. He'd pushed too hard, taken too much, created too many enemies. The dam waited upstream, patient as death, holding back the accumulated weight of winter's snow. Spring was coming, and with it, the power to wash away Mansfield's crimes and restore the natural order to a valley that had been too long under the boot of unnatural greed. I looked down at the lights of Sunset Ridge development, counting 35 houses now complete and occupied by families who had no idea they were living in the path of justice. Their developer had stolen the protection of the dam when he stole my land. Their HOA had endorsed that theft with every legal threat, every fraudulent claim, every attempt to drive me from the place where I belonged. Soon they would learn what it meant to live without protection, to face the uncontrolled power of water and time and consequence. They wanted to be part of Mansfield's war against everything I stood for. They were about to discover what defeat looked like when it arrived with the force of a river reclaiming its floodplain. Spring was coming, and with it, the flood. It was the day the neighborhood celebrated its grand opening. It became the day everything collapsed. April 28th dawned clear and cold, the kind of mountain morning that promised warmth by afternoon, and drew people outdoors despite the early chill. From my kitchen window, I watched the preparations begin before sunrise, white tents appearing on the community center lawn, catering trucks navigating the freshly paved streets, volunteers hanging banners that proclaimed, "Welcome to Sunset Ridge, where dreams meet nature." The irony of that slogan wasn't lost on me. They were about to meet nature in ways they'd never imagined. The reservoir had reached capacity 3 days earlier, swollen with the heaviest snowpack in 15 years. I'd been monitoring the gauges religiously, watching the water level climb past every safety marker my father had established. Under normal circumstances, I would have begun controlled releases weeks ago, gradually lowering the reservoir to safe levels while providing irrigation water for downstream farmers. But these weren't normal circumstances. Richard Mansfield arrived at 10 in a black limousine, stepping out like a conquering hero returning to claim his victory. He wore a perfectly tailored suit and a smile that never wavered, greeting homeowners and local officials with the practiced charm of a politician. Behind him came a parade of investors, county commissioners, and media representatives, all eager to celebrate the transformation of my grandfather's wheat fields into suburban paradise. From my porch, I watched through binoculars as Mansfield worked the crowd. He pointed toward my house several times. no doubt telling the story of the stubborn old rancher who'd tried to stand in the way of progress. The laughter that followed his gestures carried across the valley like wind through broken glass. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock, followed by tours of model homes and a community barbecue that would last until sunset. Local politicians would make speeches about economic development and sustainable growth. Children would play on the new playground while their parents toured homes they might someday afford. It would be a perfect celebration of American prosperity, built on the foundation of theft and justified by the rhetoric of progress. But perfect celebrations, like perfect neighborhoods, sometimes wash away when the waters rise. I spent the morning making final preparations. The hike to the dam took longer than usual. My 70-year-old legs weren't as steady as they'd once been, and I was carrying more equipment than normal. A camera to document what was about to happen, a satellite phone to call Elena when it was over, a thermos of coffee and a sandwich, because what I was about to do would take time. Most importantly, I carried my father's journal from 1978, the one that documented the emergency flood release that had filled the valley with 6 feet of rushing water. His notes would guide me through the process, ensuring that what happened next looked like a natural disaster rather than an act of deliberate justice. The dam control platform was exactly as I'd left it during my monthly inspection. Steel wheels greased and ready. Gate mechanisms tested and functional. Spillway clear of debris. Everything my father had built to last was ready to perform one final service for the Henderson family legacy. I set up the camera on a tripod, positioning it to capture both the reservoir and the valley below. Elena would need documentation of what was about to unfold, proof that justice had been served by the power of water rather than the hand of man. The timestamp would show that everything began at exactly 2:17 p.m., 3 minutes before Mansfield cut the ribbon on his stolen paradise. Standing at the control wheel, I could see the entire valley spread below me like a detailed map. Peaceful Valley Drive ran straight through what had been my grandfather's wheat field, lined with houses that gleamed like white teeth in the afternoon sun. The community center sat where my favorite fishing hole had once reflected summer skies. The playground occupied the grove where Jake and I had built our first fort. Every structure, every street, every carefully planned element of Sunset Ridge development sat directly in the path of water that had been held back for 70 years by Henderson determination and engineering skill. They'd built their future on the foundation of my family's past, never understanding that foundations can shift when the ground beneath them turns liquid. The ribbon-cutting ceremony began right on schedule. Through my binoculars, I watched Mansfield take the microphone, his amplified voice carrying across the valley like the sound of approaching thunder. He spoke about vision and progress, about transforming empty land into homes where families could build their dreams. Empty land, as if 4 generations of Henderson history were nothing more than vacant space waiting for improvement. At 2:15, I placed my hands on the control wheel. The metal was cold under my palms, but I could feel the vibration of pressure from the reservoir, millions of gallons of mountain water pressing against steel gates, waiting to be released. My father's voice seemed to whisper from the mechanisms he'd helped design. "Water wants to go downhill, son. Our job is just to control when and where." Today, the when was now. The where was everywhere. At exactly 2:17 p.m., as Mansfield raised the ceremonial scissors to cut the ribbon, I began to turn the wheel. The gates opened slowly at first, releasing a trickle of water that seemed insignificant compared to the massive reservoir behind the dam. But fluid dynamics work exponentially. A small opening becomes a large one. A trickle becomes a torrent. A controlled release becomes an unstoppable flood. The sound started as a whisper, then grew to a murmur, then swelled into a roar that echoed off the canyon walls like the voice of an angry god. The camera captured it all, the peaceful reservoir suddenly churning with current, the spillway transforming from a concrete channel into a waterfall of biblical proportions. Below, in the valley, the celebration continued for almost a minute before anyone noticed the approaching wall of water. The sound carried down the mountainside ahead of the flood itself, a rumbling bass note that seemed to rise from the earth's core. Children stopped playing to listen. Adults paused mid-conversation, their faces showing the confusion of people hearing something that didn't belong in their carefully ordered world. Then the water came into view. It appeared first as a dark line moving through the upper valley, but as it approached the development, its true scale became apparent. The flood was 8 feet high and moving at the speed of a galloping horse, carrying with it the accumulated debris of its passage: fallen trees, boulders, pieces of irrigation equipment, chunks of asphalt torn from the county road. Mrs. Patterson screamed first, just as I'd imagined she would. Her voice pierced the afternoon air as the water swept past her white picket fence, swallowing her prize-winning roses and the "Home Sweet Home" sign she'd positioned beside her mailbox. The sound of her terror carried up the mountainside like an offering to the gods of justice. Chaos erupted as 300 people suddenly realized they were standing in a flood zone. Parents grabbed children and ran for higher ground. Elderly residents struggled toward cars that were already flooding. The catering staff abandoned their tables and fled, leaving behind elaborate spreads of food that would soon feed the fish. Mansfield stood frozen on the community center steps, the ceremonial scissors still clutched in his hand, his face showing the stunned incomprehension of a man watching his empire dissolve in real time. The ribbon he was supposed to cut fluttered in the wind created by the approaching flood, a red banner that looked disturbingly like a surrender flag. The water hit Peaceful Valley Drive with the force of a freight train. Pavement cracked and buckled. Street signs twisted and fell. Decorative lamp posts toppled like wheat before a scythe. The carefully planted trees that were supposed to provide natural beauty were uprooted and carried away, their root balls spinning like tumbleweeds in the current. House by house, the neighborhood that had stolen my inheritance began to pay the price for its crime. The flood didn't destroy everything. That hadn't been my intention. But it destroyed enough. Foundations cracked under the pressure of rushing water. First floors flooded with muddy creek water that would leave everything it touched permanently stained. Driveways washed out, lawns disappeared, gardens became temporary lakes filled with the debris of broken dreams. The community center, where the HOA had held its meetings and planned its campaign against me, proved to be as poorly constructed as everything else in Mansfield's development. The building's foundation, which should have been anchored deep enough to withstand flooding, cracked like an eggshell when the water hit. The entire structure tilted sideways, then broke apart and floated downstream in sections, carrying with it all the records of legal threats and fraudulent claims that had been used to justify my dispossession. Through my binoculars, I watched Mansfield's face cycle through disbelief, rage, and dawning understanding. He knew, even if he couldn't prove it, that this wasn't a natural disaster. His eyes kept turning toward the ridge where I stood, and even at this distance, I could see the accusation in his posture. Let him suspect. Suspicion wasn't proof, and proof was something he'd never find. What was happening in the valley below was simply the inevitable result of building in a floodplain, the predictable consequence of constructing a neighborhood in the path of water that had been artificially controlled for 70 years. Remove that control, whether through equipment failure, natural disaster, or human intervention, and nature would reclaim what had always been hers. Emergency sirens began wailing in the distance, but they were too late and too few. The county's disaster response plan had been designed for house fires and car accidents, not for the calculated flooding of an entire subdivision. Fire trucks couldn't reach the development because the roads were underwater. Ambulances couldn't navigate streets that had become temporary rivers. The flood lasted for 40 minutes before I began closing the gates. Not because the reservoir was empty, there was still plenty of water behind the dam, but because 40 minutes was enough. 40 minutes to destroy the infrastructure. 40 minutes to make the houses unlivable. 40 minutes to wash away the streets and sewers and utilities that had been built on stolen land. Most importantly, 40 minutes to ensure that Sunset Ridge development would never be the same. That the families who'd moved into houses built on my grandfather's wheat fields would have to find somewhere else to live. Somewhere that wasn't protected by the goodwill of a man they'd helped to destroy. As the water receded, it left behind a landscape that looked like a war zone. Vehicles sat tilted at crazy angles, their windows shattered and interiors filled with mud. Trees hung upside down from power lines that sparked and sizzled in the afternoon air. The playground equipment had been scattered across 3 blocks, with the slide ending up on someone's roof and the swing set wrapped around a telephone pole like a metallic pretzel. The media crews arrived within an hour, their helicopters circling the devastation like mechanical vultures. News vans from 3 states converged on the valley, their reporters breathlessly describing the unexpected flood that destroyed a brand-new development on what experts are calling unstable ground in a known flood plain. Elena's first article appeared online within hours, accompanied by photographs that told the story better than words ever could. She'd been positioned downstream with a professional camera, capturing images of the flood's arrival, the panic of the residents, the destruction of the infrastructure. But more importantly, she'd been documenting the paper trail that led to this moment. The fraudulent surveys, the bribed officials, the pattern of corruption that had made this disaster inevitable. By evening, as the sun set over the muddy remains of what had been Mansfield's triumph, the narrative was already shifting. Initial reports of a natural disaster were being replaced by questions about why anyone had been allowed to build in such an obviously dangerous location. Investigative reporters were requesting copies of geological surveys, floodplain maps, and building permits. Insurance companies were refusing to pay claims, arguing that the development had been constructed in a known flood zone without proper safeguards. Richard Mansfield's empire, built on stolen land and fraudulent documentation, was drowning in the same waters that had washed away his perfect neighborhood. The legal challenges would continue for years, but the physical reality was undeniable. Sunset Ridge development was finished, and the families who'd invested their savings in houses built on my grandfather's wheat field would have to find new places to call home. I stood on the dam platform until well after dark, watching the lights of emergency vehicles move through the valley like fireflies in the gathering gloom. The satellite phone in my jacket would connect me to Elena whenever I was ready to call her, to provide whatever statement she needed for her story. But that could wait until tomorrow. Tonight belonged to the sound of Cedar Creek running free, carrying away the debris of broken dreams and returned promises. They'd built a neighborhood on my land, thinking that concrete and legal papers could erase the memory of what had come before. They'd mocked my stubborn refusal to surrender, called me a bitter old man who couldn't accept the inevitability of progress. But when the water rose, the truth rose with it. And that truth was simple. Some things can't be stolen. Some ground can't be stolen. Some justice can't be denied forever. Water always finds a way. When the flood ended, the neighborhood was gone, but something far more powerful had risen. The headlines began appearing within hours, spreading across state and national news like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Luxury development destroyed by flood in known floodplain. Questions mount over permits for doomed subdivision. Families homeless after community built on stolen. Land washes away. Elena's investigative series ran for 2 weeks straight, each article peeling back another layer of corruption that had made the disaster inevitable. She'd been preparing for months, gathering evidence and documentation, that painted a picture so damning that even Mansfield's political allies began distancing themselves from the wreckage of his empire. The insurance companies were the first to abandon ship. Within 48 hours of the flood, every major insurer with policies in Sunset Ridge development announced they would not be paying claims, citing construction in an unauthorized flood zone and failure to disclose known geological hazards. The legal language was complex, but the message was simple. The homeowners were on their own. That's when the real investigation began. The FBI arrived on Tuesday, their black SUVs climbing my gravel drive like a funeral procession. I watched them approach from my kitchen window, feeling a mixture of resignation and satisfaction. This moment had always been inevitable. The only question was whether I'd be arrested as a criminal or interviewed as a victim. Special Agent Sarah Chen, no relation to Mary. Chen, from our resistance meeting, was a woman in her 40s with the kind of alert intelligence that missed nothing and forgot less. She sat at my kitchen table with a digital recorder between us, her questions precise and carefully phrased. "Mr. Henderson, I understand you've been in a property dispute with Mansfield Development Group for several years." "That's one way to put it," I said. "Another way would be to say they've been stealing my family's land piece by piece for 2 years. Can you tell me about your relationship with the dam?" "It's on my property, built by my father in 1952. I've been maintaining it for 20 years, ever since Dad passed. Monthly inspections, regular maintenance, controlled releases for irrigation and flood control." "Were you aware that Sunset Ridge development was constructed in the dam's flood zone?" I almost smiled at that. "Agent Chen, I've been watching that flood zone for 70 years. I know every inch of ground down there, every tree, every rise and fall of the land. Anyone who looked at a topographical map from before 1952 would know that the whole development was built where Cedar Creek used to spread out during spring floods." "Did you make any attempt to warn Mansfield Development about this hazard?" "I tried to warn everyone, county commissioners, the sheriff's office, anyone who would listen. But Mansfield had deeper pockets and better connections than a stubborn old rancher." Agent Chen's questions continued for 3 hours, covering every aspect of the dam's operation. My knowledge of flood patterns, my relationship with various officials, and the timeline of events leading up to the disaster. She was thorough but not hostile, treating me more like a witness than a suspect. "Mr. Henderson, our engineers have examined the dam and its control mechanisms. They found no evidence of sabotage or unusual wear. The equipment functioned exactly as designed." "That's because Dad built it right," I said. "Steel and concrete don't lie." They also found that the reservoir was at historically high levels due to heavy snowpack. A release of some kind was inevitable to prevent overflow and potential dam failure. I nodded. "Been tracking the water levels all spring. Knew something had to give eventually." The timing of the release during the grand opening ceremony has raised some questions. I looked her straight in the eye. "Agent Chen, I've been operating that dam for 20 years. I release water when it needs to be released, not according to some developer's party schedule. If Mansfield had bothered to check flood patterns before building his neighborhood, he would have known that late April is prime time for high water in this valley." She made notes in her tablet, then leaned back in her chair. "The investigation is ongoing, but I can tell you that our primary focus is on the corruption that allowed construction in a flood zone, not on the flood itself. Natural disasters aren't crimes, Mr. Henderson, but the fraudulent documentation that put people in harm's way, that's definitely criminal." After the FBI left, I walked down to survey the damage up close. The floodwaters had receded, leaving behind a moonscape of mud, debris, and twisted metal that bore no resemblance to the perfect suburb that had existed 3 days earlier. Peaceful Valley Drive was gone, replaced by a channel of raw earth that looked like a dry riverbed. Most of the houses still stood, but they were wounded beyond repair. Foundations cracked, first floors gutted, utilities destroyed. The community center had simply vanished, leaving only a concrete pad and some scattered debris to mark where the HOA had once held its meetings. The playground equipment had been scattered across half a mile, creating a surreal landscape of swings hanging from power lines and slides embedded in front yards. The golf course that was supposed to anchor the development's eastern end was now a series of muddy ponds connected by channels that would never appear on any course. Map Richard Mansfield stood in what used to be the center of his triumph, surrounded by lawyers and insurance adjusters and engineers with clipboards. His expensive suit was wrinkled and mud-stained, his perfectly styled hair disheveled, his confident smile replaced by the hollow expression of a man watching his empire crumble in real time. When he saw me approaching, his face flushed red with rage and humiliation. "You did this," he said, his voice carrying across the devastated landscape. "I don't know how, but you did this." "I operated a dam according to safety protocols established by the Army Corps of Engineers," I replied calmly. "If you'd bothered to research flood patterns before stealing my family's land, you might have chosen a different location for your development." "This isn't over, Henderson. I'll prove what you did. I'll sue you for everything you have." "You're welcome to try, but you might want to focus on the FBI investigation first. I hear they're very interested in how you got permits to build in a flood zone." The lawsuits came fast and furious, just as I'd expected. Mansfield sued me for property damage, claiming I'd deliberately flooded his development. Homeowners sued Mansfield for fraud and misrepresentation. Insurance companies sued everyone, trying to avoid paying claims on houses that should never have been built. The county got sued for issuing illegal permits, and the state got sued for failing to oversee county officials. But the criminal charges came faster. By the end of May, Richard Mansfield was under indictment for racketeering, bribery, and fraud. 3 county commissioners had been arrested. The county attorney's office was under investigation by the state attorney general. Sheriff Hawkins had resigned in disgrace, and Deputy Martinez had been promoted to interim sheriff while a new election was organized. Elena's Pulitzer prize-winning series had exposed a web of corruption that stretched across 3 counties and involved dozens of officials who'd been selling their authority to the highest bidder. The story went national, then international, becoming a symbol of what happened when greed was allowed to triumph over law and common sense. The families who'd lost their homes in Sunset Ridge development became heroes rather than victims. They'd been deceived by criminals, not defeated by nature. Their stories of fighting insurance, companies and seeking justice from corrupt officials gained them public sympathy and legal support from attorneys who worked pro bono on high-profile cases. Most of the residents found new homes within a year, their legal settlements providing enough money to start over somewhere safer. A few thanked me personally, understanding that the flood had revealed the fraud that might have cost them even more in the long run. Mrs. Patterson, whose screams had been the first sound of the disaster, sent me a Christmas card with a picture of her new garden in Colorado. "Thank you for saving us from our own bad judgment," she wrote. "We should have listened to you from the beginning." The land itself began to heal with surprising speed. Cedar Creek, freed from the artificial constraints of storm drains and concrete channels, carved new patterns across the valley floor. Willows and cottonwoods sprouted in the rich soil deposited by the flood. Native grasses returned to areas that had been covered by exotic lawns. Within 2 years, it was hard to tell that Sunset Ridge development had ever existed. Nature had a way of erasing the mistakes of human arrogance, given enough time and water. I kept the dam operational, releasing water for irrigation and flood control, just as my father had taught me. But I also knew that my time as its guardian was limited. At 72, I wasn't getting any younger, and the responsibility of controlling a river required strength and judgment that wouldn't last forever. The solution came from an unexpected source. The state of Colorado, embarrassed by the corruption scandal and eager to prevent future disasters, offered to purchase the dam and surrounding watershed for inclusion in the state park system. The price was more than fair, and the agreement included a provision that the land would be maintained as open space in perpetuity, protected from development by law rather than the stubbornness of one old rancher. I signed the papers on a warm afternoon in September, 3 years after the flood that had washed away Mansfield's empire and restored justice to Cedar Creek Valley. Elena was there to document the ceremony, along with state officials and environmental groups that had fought to protect mountain watersheds. "Any regrets, Bull?" she asked, as we watched the sun set over land that would now be protected forever. I thought about my father, about my grandfather, about all the Henderson men who'd worked this ground and loved this place and passed it on to the next generation. They'd built something lasting with their hands and their hearts, something that couldn't be destroyed by greed or erased by legal trickery. "No regrets," I said. "They tried to drown me in paperwork. Instead, I drowned them in water." Sometimes, that's what it takes to wash away the sins of the world and let something clean grow back in their place. The creek sang its approval in the gathering darkness, carrying the voice of mountains and memory downstream toward a valley that had learned to respect the power of water and the patience of justice. Somewhere in that sound, I heard the laughter of my father and the whisper of promises kept. They'd built a neighborhood on my land, thinking that concrete could erase history and legal papers could rewrite the laws of nature. But when the water rose, the truth rose with it, and that truth was something that would outlast all of us. That some ground is sacred, some promises are unbreakable, and some justice flows as inevitably as water finding its way to the sea. The Henderson name would end with me, but the Henderson legacy would flow forever in the creek that sang past my father's dam, carrying with it the memory of men who stood their ground when standing was the hardest thing to do. That was worth more than all the development deals and political corruption in the world. That was worth the flood. That was worth the flood.